everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Educator Insights. I'm one of your hosts, Olivia Laragresti, and I'm excited to get us started. Today, we are joined by Frederick T. Worley, who's the founder of Edu Studios. He also holds a PhD in Management Studies from the University of Paris, Sorbonne, and a degree in biology, which, fun fact, I also hold. So that was fun for us to connect on. And over his career, he's shifted between research positions and leadership in continuing education and higher education. And so we're excited to talk today about, blending some insights from neuroscience, behavioral science, and educational innovation. So Frederick, thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
So I wanted to actually just, start us off as a former educator myself and, folks who are working in the education space. I'd love to ask you a little bit about how you feel that your education experience as a student and, graduate student, maybe TA, those sorts of roles, but how that kind of informed some of your understanding of pedagogical excellence and sort of what's needed in the educational space.
Yeah, I couldn't escape pedagogy because I come from a household of educators. Both my parents were in education, and so I've bathed in this since my youngest age. And I must say, I was not necessarily a big fan of the education that I received myself, K through 12, and in higher education, particularly in K through 12, what I did in Germany was very interesting in terms of a very broad curriculum, but it was very, how to say, out of context. And so being very much Gen Y millennial, I was always wanting to know why I'm learning something, and evidently the answers were not necessarily forthcoming. And so I did my undergrad and master's in Germany and in biology, as you said, but specializing in neuroscience and behavioral ecology. And it's very interesting because I learned of a very a nascent field in neuroscience, which was effectively looking into schema theory, which has been known in learning science and education science for a while. But in neuroscience, it actually has never really been deeply, if you want, studied until the late 2000s, and started actually with animal experiments. But very quickly, the neuroscientists found out that most of what we have learned about learning in terms of building synapses and having to repeat things and rehearse things for synaptic pathways to strengthen and so on, that's all true, but is a very specific mode of learning that is relatively rare and quite unique to the first years of your life normally. It's the years where you have to flick a light switch 100 times to build the synaptic pathways of a light switch, if you want. But once you have context, your brain usually learns to a completely different pathway. And through those pathways, you can basically assimilate information into an active schema, meaning it's a framework, mental framework that is active and that absorbs information and adapts to that new information almost instantaneously. So translating that into education, that means you're basically learning instantaneously. So I was very interested in that neuroscience and was able during my PhD, which was actually in consumer behavior and not really related to this, I was able to apply it while I was working as a lecturer and later in program designer and director of an entire bachelor, and then later director of accreditation and so on. So through all my positions, I was able to kind of come back to this neuroscience and watch it as it evolved and kind of formalize it into a way of creating courses and curricula that is quite different. And in a nutshell is simply put, is to teach everything within context, which learning designers and experts would know as in-context learning or applied or experiential learning.
Yeah, I appreciate you, sharing a little bit about some of those connections. I think that as a former teacher myself, there are, there's so much that teachers are learning and being trained on, but there's also so much from other fields that we're attempting to put into practice, but sometimes don't get enough time to really sit with the information, the research itself. So it's cool to hear you share a little bit more on that. And I think, you know, I think we all share everyone's had some experience in their educational pathway that was not, totally what they were hoping for. Of course, hopefully everyone can name one good teacher, but there's always something missing. So I appreciate you sharing that there were areas that clearly, you've had some thoughts on where there's room for innovation. And so I wanted to jump in. You've with Edgeo Studios, you've been, I think, championing a really interesting concept of generative courses. And so before we get into the depths of that, I know that you recently did a panel event with the United States Distance Learning Association, and through that panel, share a little bit about why you think generative courses are so important for the future of education. So I was curious if you could just speak a little bit to how you see the educational space changing, particularly with online learning. We know that there are many teachers and educators out there listening who are online learning teachers, and then also folks who are trying to create those courses. So curious if you could talk a little bit about what you see as the future of online learning in that sense.
Yeah, I mean, having overseen large portfolios of online courses and trying to prepare or keep them up to date even and prepare for all the changes that are coming, it became very obvious to me that online education, or that model, is really in a vice at the moment, or in a room that has the walls closing in on it. On one side, AI is driving so much change in almost every profession that the content really needs to be updated very frequently, particularly in continuing education, but even higher education, primary education. The fields are changing, the applications are changing, and what you do in practice once you're in working is changing very quickly. And so, in particularly higher education, in many institutions, you have 5 to 10 year program or course review cycles. And already today, or before AI, that didn't make much sense for continuing education. But particularly now, if you have a field, I know marketing evidently a little bit closer, that is changing completely within 12 months, and then changing again in the next 12 months, and then again, and so on and so forth for the foreseeable future. I cannot rely on my static content that I have created once and I paid a subject matter expert once to create. So the content system, or the system that I had in place for updating my content, doesn't work anymore. Or if I want to use that system that I have, it will cost me basically my entire margin for the course to keep it up to date. On the other side, AI is also driving a different user expectation. So if students are facing static content, they will very much on their own already go to AI and actually ask AI and learn with a chatbot, for example, rather than learning from the static content that they have. And they expect much more personalized content. They expect the ability to interact with the content. And so the model of I pay once a subject matter expert and instructional design team, and then review every 5 years or so doesn't work.
Oh, go ahead.
And again, the key there being the static content being the problem, both for the cost of updating, and B, for the shifting demands of the students. So what I've been working on is effectively addressing very specifically that point: is how can we figure out a solution that addresses this problem of static content. And interestingly enough, the core idea of the generative course model versus the online course model is to replace very specifically static course elements with interactive ones that are powered by AI.
Yeah, and I appreciate you coming from sort of all angles here, right? There's the fact that the space we are in, the expectations are changing in terms of what learners are looking for, but then also coming from an economic standpoint, anyone who's creating these online courses needs to think about a balance between update, the cost to update a course, and then the, risk of not updating that, right? What enrollment drops will be seen, and even just as a, course developer standing behind the quality of a course. And so I would love to just kind of like provide our listeners with a definition. In your mind, what are generative courses? Are these just courses that are completely generated by AI, or how would you define them?
Well, actually, I think that's maybe the name is not the best chosen in that sense, but that's actually inaccurate in the sense of there is a school out there and people out there, and I've worked on this quite a bit myself, who are trying to generate the entire course with AI, right? And it's actually very good practice to try to do this because it allows you to figure out how to prompt correctly, but this content remains static, even if you create the entire course with AI. And so the problem remains. The point of the generative course is really the generative in the moment, where the student has the opportunity to have AI create or generate the content when they are consulting it. So let me give a practical example. I think that'll make it clearer. So if I have a lesson text in an online course that has a certain structure, I remember a course like the Introduction to Marketing starts in the first module with the history of marketing, and the subject matter expert has decided to slice it from, I don't know, 1900 to 1930s, 1930s to 50s, and so on and so forth. So they have their structure and they have their nomenclature for these different phases. Instead of writing out what each phase is and creating the static content, the instructor can go and create a prompt for a platform such as Google Learnabout, or for an AI that has a study mode or learning mode, that asks the AI to create that timeline and explain the history of marketing in the chunks that the subject matter expert is interested in chunking it in, so that the student effectively at that moment, instead of being presented with a static text, clicks on a link, it opens the AI interface, and it gives you this, for example, like generate the timeline, and gives you as the student the opportunity to then dig deeper into each timeline. Honestly, while it's still an experiment, Google Learnabout is probably the closest to being able to actually make sense in terms of a tool to use in this case. But again, Google Learnabout is still an experiment. It basically creates a course page on the fly for you that's interactive and that you can ask questions and engage with. But any institution could decide to create such a platform for itself. The key point there is that at that point, the student can ask any follow-up question, go deeper, go down rabbit holes, try to explore the topic as much as they are interested in. And if the platform knows about the student, so let's say knows the course content, knows the type of student, maybe even knows them more personally, the AI can use metaphors that make sense for the student, can talk to them more personally, can present the content in a way that is conscious of what they already know or what they don't know. And the AI can be parametered to make sure the student goes as far as they need to really understand the content.
So yeah, I heard a lot of pieces there. I think just to break it down a little bit. So I sort of started my question is it just created by AI? But it sounds like the where we're leaning on the subject matter experts, whether that's an instructor or a course developer, here is really to guide some of the prompting that a student might be doing, as well as, and so that's coming from what the curriculum is, and then also setting the parameters as to, okay, it may start with this prompt, but what is the learning objective that student should ultimately get to? So the role of the subject matter expert or instructor here is to sort of guide the student towards some prompts that they can use with AI tools. The students then kind of in the driver's seat with some guidance on what prompts to use, and then as well as informing the learning objectives that the student should get to. So would the student be reaching those learning objectives through their rabbit holes, or would there be, what are sort of the guardrails that you're envisioning so the student actually meets those learning objectives in the end?
Well, that's actually the easiest way to conceive of a generative course, is to take an existing course where you, as the subject matter expert, have your defined learning objectives and you have your assessments set, right? So effectively your course is auditable, it's conforming to accreditation standards. And the difference is that you are effectively creating and designing prompts that the students will use to effectively read the content that you would like them to read. Knowing that they can evidently interact with it and go down rabbit holes. The key point here is that the subject matter expert has a lot of accountability for the content that is generated, just as much as they have now accountability for the content that they create or write or generate on their own. And the way that works is, the institution needs to provide models that have either the study mode or the something like Learnabout that is vetted, and these models are already functioning at a level or at a standard where they ground themselves in resources that are of a higher quality. So they don't go to Reddit, for example, to find answers, which, for example, Learnabout and learning modes in general do. Right, so they have better grounding. So that's one premise. But B, the particular accountability and responsibility of the instructor is to design the prompts and then engineer the prompts to the point where they have little variability in terms of their output, and the output that they produce is reliably what they agree is a good output, right? So there's the quality element that comes from the models and the modes that are used, and then there's a quality element from the instructional designer or subject matter expert to make sure that the output is good. And then the third layer is actually that the subject matter expert uses aggregated data that is consistently fed back from these interactions that the students have to improve the prompts or potentially fine-tune the model. There's even the possibility to allow the model to learn itself and improve itself. So it's a quite interesting change here in terms of the interaction and how the student, the content that the student perceives is not created once and vetted once. The content that the students gets presented with is constantly controlled and is in a system that technically improves the quality over time. The rabbit hole thing comes up relatively frequently when we talk about generative courses. And to be very honest, I think this rabbit hole phenomenon of people going down rabbit holes when they start engaging with AI is a temporary artifact, something that's happening right now because people are not yet used to using AI very efficiently. So the AI literacy is not necessarily there, but also they just went through an education system that never allowed them to go down rabbit holes, right? So I see it as a temporary effect, and I've seen this happen with students and colleagues that they do go down rabbit holes for a while until they are actually able to kind of satiate their curiosity and kind of learn how to most efficiently use the tools, and then it subsides. So with oncoming generations of Gen Alpha, I think we will have much less of that problem, and it will be a temporary problem for Gen Z or adult learners.
Yeah, I guess that is actually a question. So, and I think, I'm thinking back to, that old Wikipedia game of, finding, getting from one Wikipedia to the other through those links, rabbit holes, whatever you'd like to call
Yeah,
them in that sense. And so there's definitely an element of curiosity here, I think, from, as a former science teacher, a big piece of, the pedagogical model essentially focused on inquiry-based learning, right? Having
yeah,
students asking the questions. And that's been, you know, uh, in other disciplines as well, they're leveraging that skill set or that tool, which really serves as a motivator. So I think it's interesting to think about this concept of rabbit holes as a temporary stage. And one thing I would kind of ask about that is I think there is a huge benefit to those. I think to your point, like folks have not had the opportunity to be curious in that sense. But you mentioned something about AI literacy. So how do you see AI literacy changing, how people are relating to this rabbit hole concept if they are effectively able to kind of start a learning experience using Gen AI that accomplishes specific goals that have been preset versus walking away much more knowledgeable, but maybe not about any of the subjects that they walked into it planning to be.
well, as I said, I think I don't know that you need to engineer or anyone needs to engineer particular guardrails on this, because I mean, if a student goes and learns much more than I asked them to learn, hooray, right? I piqued their curiosity and so on. So that's exciting to me as an educator, and I'm actually extremely surprised that this has even been a discussion and is a recurrent discussion around students going down rabbit holes with AI, because shouldn't we all be extremely excited about this? That students have a means to satisfy their curiosity, and like, think about how much we have discussed of how hard it is for students to make transfer of knowledge into other domains and so on. So yeah, if they start with something I gave them and they end up trailing into something completely different, as long as the output is of quality, with good models and so on, and within a framework, I don't see a problem there. But I don't see a problem in the sense of, I believe that students will or at least what I've seen is that students can self-regulate a lot. Evidently, if they go down rabbit holes for hours and then they don't get to their assignments, or they don't get their things done, I think they will be self-regulating relatively quickly. What I would urge designers to do, though, is to measure this and build it in this quality improvement process. Because in certain cases, it might be an indication that either the question was too broad, or the prompt was too broad, or that maybe not enough content was covered. Students might have gaps, might be individual students that need follow up for this, and so on and so forth. So there's a well of information in people going down rabbit holes as well. So as I said, I don't see it as a problem particularly. I see it as an opportunity. And in the future, for people that have just grown up with AI or have become very comfortable with it, I don't think they will have the same issues. I could go a little bit deeper, but I don't want to trail off too much. There's a whole thing about how we all learned through our K through 12 and higher education system, that didn't allow us necessarily to achieve mastery. And so we all accumulated certain gaps. And it's quite interesting to consider that if students start learning with AI, they might learn at mastery from their youngest age.
Wow, yeah, that's a really interesting space to think about, just the opportunity that we really have in this day and age with education. And I think that actually does bring me to another question I wanted to ask about. You talked about learning gaps, and we all know that not every educational experience is designed equitably or has equitable results, even within the same classroom, that sort of thing. And so I'm curious, as we're, I think the first promise with AI was one of the first things that kept coming up was personalization, right?
Mm.
And so I'm just curious, for students who might have more access or support, taking one of these courses, what can educators do to make these experiences inclusive and provide that guidance that the student who might get distracted and not reach their learning objective or may find gaps, how can educators make these experiences more inclusive and more equitable?
Yeah, there's a lot there that can be done. I don't think I mean, there is some limitation in terms of access to the technology, but I think there's a lot of good initiatives across the globe actually to make AI technology accessible to everybody. So I think that's actively being worked on. But I think where I've seen most of the inequities is, to your point, the availability of somebody who can personally make sure each student has the possibility to close their gaps or to achieve mastery in any of the topics that is taught. And so from K through 12, you see evidently that in schools where you have crowded classrooms, very few teachers, that's not necessarily possible. And that's where the inequities start. And this is where AI can intervene. I was on a panel here in the region in LA and a year ago, and a lot of panelists were philosophizing about the ethics and the implications of AI on education. And one person was on the panel. She was a grandma, and she said, "This is all nice and good what you're saying, but I must be honest. I went through K through 12 and learned absolutely nothing, because when I was little, in my first years of schooling, um, I had trouble with my colors, I had trouble with my numbers, and with my letters. And by the time, even though I raised my hand, by the time the teacher came around to me, the class was over. And so I ended up having such big gaps that I effectively felt like I learned nothing in 12 years of schooling." And she's so happy and delighted that her granddaughter now has AI and can literally make sure with her mom, when doing homework, that she understands absolutely everything that is taught. And that's a an incredibly powerful tool for equity in the sense of the entire systemic construct that exists, that makes it so that marginalized communities, for example, do not have access to education that allows them to achieve mastery, is counteracted, if you want. So if there is an effort in school districts, for example, that are resource stricken, to provide this AI literacy to the families of the kids, there's a huge opportunity for them to develop systems and processes so that these families can use the readily accessible AI to make sure their kids achieve mastery and don't accumulate gaps.
Yeah, I appreciate you mentioning that. And I think as we think about bringing equity into education or continuing to do so through things like generative AI courses or generative courses, there's a lot of talk on durable skills. I think especially as knowledge is becoming very accessible. That's what AI is doing for us. And so, what really I think has been in sharp relief recently has been the skills and these durable skills. And so I'm curious from your perspective, as these courses and learning tools become more and more adaptive, what durable skills do you think students need to learn how to stay curious and thoughtful in this ever-changing world?
It's actually fascinating if you think about it. What is this what is the constant competence and skill that you need if everything constantly changes, right? And for me, that's effectively learning. And I say this with all earnesty in the sense of one of the biggest issues we have today in higher education and K through 12 is that the schooling in many, many schools that we have extinguishes the flame of curiosity. And I think this has been talked about at length and realized at length that what is oftentimes called as like industrialized curriculum, while it has been beneficial 100 years ago to educate the masses, it has become a system that effectively, very efficiently turns off the curiosity of most of the students. So we have in a classroom the standard 10% are still curious and 90% are just there phenomenon. And the problem that we're facing there is that we effectively have trained 90% of the population to really see no purpose in learning and education. And yet that is the only thing that will allow them to function in a world that is constantly changing, especially when about every cognitive skill is in the process of being automated. And I remember a colleague asking me whether or not, or what I thought about how much AI was overhyped in education. And I said, I don't believe it's overhyped at all. I think it's very much underhyped. I think people in general, many institutions and many educators do not fully grasp the depth of change that is already happening in industry and the absolute necessity for people to be able and willing to learn for the rest of their lives constantly.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of conversations on the level. Are we appropriately hyping or are we over under hyping the changes that are taking place in our world? But I think it's great to think about. And I think it's going to be something that, from K through 20 and parents and guardians as well are going to need to be thinking about just how are we positioning education and what is really the purpose and goal. So I appreciate your thoughts on that. And so I'm curious, any recommendations you have for folks on where they can learn more about anything of this or on in terms of generative courses or how to support students with their AI literacy that you think would be good to recommend?
I would recommend actually experimenting more than anything, and this is a little bit of some. It's a situation I believe particularly educators need to realize is that our reflex of, oh, where has this been researched? Give me the book, give me the paper, give me the example. Doesn't really work at a time of an industrial revolution with accelerated technological change, because most of the things haven't been researched yet. And if they have been researched, by the time they're published, technology is a universe away, right? In terms of capabilities. So a lot of the discourse that I see in education right now is actually based on model capabilities from past year, which seems 10 years ago. And in AI time, people are still talking about hallucinations and things like this. And so the interesting perspective that I would give to people, and this is both educators and learners, is you have all the answers basically in the tools. The only thing is choose your tools with care, meaning if you take a cheap open model, your output will be quite mediocre. But choose if you can, the higher quality tools that are available to you. They're still not necessarily cost prohibitive. And then allow yourself to experiment with them. So the generative course model is very simple to implement and to test. by effectively just trying to have content generated on the fly that you would otherwise have in your course. And many courses, many instructors already do this for their courses, right? They don't tell anyone, but they have used generative AI to create course content. And many students out there use generative AI already to actually learn. They take, for example, the title or the content of the course and copy paste it into a chatbot and then interact with the chatbot in order to ask their questions and learn the content. So it's not far-fetched. It's just for those who haven't tried it and haven't experienced it, I would very much recommend doing so.
Yeah, and I want to actually push you on that if I can. You mentioned experimenting, which I think is extremely helpful. And to your point, how to stay really actually up to date. And I think with that, there are folks out there who might say, well, how do I experiment? Right. So there are tools out there, and pushing themselves to use the highest quality tools. When I think about experimenting, there is the idea of sort of playing around with it, prompting. There's also, hey, I'm going to try the same prompt in 5 different tools. And so any specific ideas you have on how to actually experiment with some of these tools to stay up to date and sort of have that experience to speak from?
Yes, so I would start with the very simple experiment, which is try to get generative AI to do what you are supposed to do. So when you're an instructor and you're generating course content, use the models that you have available, and to your point, ideally test different models, and then prompt it to generate the content that you're supposed to generate, for example, for your course. Right? If you're a student, take the course content and try to make it so that it's interesting to you, right? And use prompts to do that. The key here is most people are still looking, many people, I wouldn't even say most, but many people I've talked to are still looking to demonstrate to themselves that the output of generative AI is not as good as what they would produce. And so if you start the experiment, you will 100% find that to be a truth. The key of the experiment is to continue because you want to get to the point. You want to engineer the prompt that will allow the generative AI model to produce at the quality that is equal to yours or even better. And that's the main difference in terms of the experimentation, is what goal do you set yourself? If you tinker around and play around with it, you will very quickly find that the average output is average and biased and potentially full of hallucinations. Your task of the experimentation is, how do I engineer the prompt, the interaction, so that it does produce at the same quality that I produce or better?
That's really helpful and spoken like a true educator, thinking about, stating those learning outcomes and objectives there. So, I really appreciate your thoughts. I think that what you've been working on and just the experience that you're drawing from, I'm really interested to keep following along and seeing how, generative courses and just, the shape of what education can look like really changes over the next few years and many years to come.
Yeah, and I'm excited to keep the discussion going also with the larger community. To be very honest, something we didn't touch upon, but where it actually really gets exciting is once you have transformed your static content parts into generative ones, then you can actually go and try to transform your learning activities, your assignments, into generative ones. And that's where you get into the exciting field of simulations, either with chatbots or even with virtual environments where you can recreate entire scenarios that students can experience and live through, for example, a learning experience. So there's a whole world of beautiful learning activities and learning experiences that we can design with AI that we haven't been able to do before. And if we are able to gain some bandwidth and allow ourselves to have time to design these learning activities to be more interactive, we can really get into a completely different realm of what a course looks like. And it's not just going to be a online course where parts are generatively created or generated, but it's going to be a course where students are living an entire interactive experience.
Yeah, there's so much that so much to look forward to, and also to kind of stay curious about and to stay on theme.
Yeah.
But appreciate you for joining us today, and definitely anyone who wants to stay involved in the conversation, reach out to our team here, and definitely to Frederick on to learn more about what he's working on and continue the conversation. But thank you so much, Frederick, for joining us. Really appreciate having you, and thanks everyone for listening.
Thank you so much for having me.